You take this fuel, the old man said, his hands already unscrewing the jerry can, and you get to your brother. That's all that matters tonight. The biker stared at him. Old man, do you have any idea who I am? Sebastian Bennett looked up at the death's head patch, at the massive arms, at the hard eyes that had probably seen things no decent person should ever see. Then he looked back down at the jerry can. Don't matter who you are, he said. What matters is where you're trying to go. If a story like this one hits you somewhere deep, somewhere you didn't expect, I want you to subscribe to this channel and follow every part of Sebastian's story all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning. The night Sebastian Bennett decided to change his life, he almost didn't stop. That was the thing nobody would understand later. Not his daughter, not the reporters, not the people who would eventually hear this story and nod like they'd always known a man like him was capable of something like that. Nobody would understand that for 3 full seconds, Sebastian's foot held steady on the gas pedal and his eyes fixed straight ahead on the white broken line of Highway 155, and he made absolutely no move to pull over. 3 seconds. That's how close the whole thing came to not happening at all. It was 11:47 at night on a Tuesday in November, and Sebastian had been driving for 4 hours on a road that felt like the end of the world. Out here, Highway 155 didn't care about you. It cut through the high desert like a wound that never healed, nothing on either side but scrub brush and dark scale and the occasional coyote flash caught in the headlights for half a second before the dark swallowed it again. The temperature had dropped to 29 degrees. Sebastian knew this because the little thermometer clipped to his visor hadn't lied to him once in 11 years, and it was reading 29 with a small blinking snowflake that meant the asphalt was close to icing. He was driving a 2003 Ford F-15. Oh, that had no business being on the road. The rear passenger window was sealed with a plastic garbage bag and electrical tape. The heat worked on the driver's side only, which meant the left half of his body was almost comfortable, while his right leg stayed cold enough that he'd stopped feeling his knees somewhere around mile marker 40. The radio had died in September, and he hadn't replaced it because he couldn't afford to, and because the silence after 62 years of living had stopped bothering him the way it used to. Sebastian worked nights. He had for the last 11 years since Evelyn passed, and the house got sold and the life he'd built got quietly disassembled, the way they disassemble carnival rides, fast, efficient, and with no concern for what they look like standing up. He was the head custodian at Ridgeline Elementary School in Barstow. Head custodian meant he was the only custodian. The job paid $16.40 an hour, which came out to just under $1,400 a month after taxes, which covered the lot rent on his trailer at Desert Pines, the minimum payment on 3 credit cards he never used anymore, but couldn't close because they were the only credit he had, the insurance on the truck and groceries with about $60 left over at the end of each month that he kept in an envelope in his kitchen drawer and tried very hard not to touch. Tonight, coming back from Victorville, he'd driven out to his daughter Carla's place to drop off her birthday present. 3 days late because he'd had to wait for his check to clear. The truck's fuel gauge was sitting on the red. Had been sitting on the red for 30 miles. Sebastian knew this truck. He knew exactly how far into the red he could push it before the engine started to stutter, and he was approaching that number with the particular focused calm of a man who had long since run out of room for panic. In the bed of his truck, strapped down with a single bungee cord, was a red 5-gallon jerry can. It held approximately 1¼ gallons of gasoline. He'd been carrying it as an emergency reserve for 3 weeks because the fuel pump had started to whine on cold mornings, and he didn't trust the truck to make it to the next paycheck without the backup. That jerry can was not a luxury. That jerry can was the difference between getting to work on Thursday and not getting to work on Thursday, and not getting to work on Thursday was the difference between keeping his job and losing it. He saw the motorcycle first because of the reflective strip on the rear fender. It caught his headlights at about 300 feet, just a flash of orange-white in the blackness, and his brain registered it as debris. Before his eyes corrected the signal and told him, "No, that's a vehicle," and then his brain corrected again and said the vehicle is stopped, and then everything happened very fast. He saw the bike pulled half off the shoulder, leaning on its kickstand at an angle that said it wasn't going anywhere. He saw the size of it, a big touring Harley, the kind of machine that cost more than Sebastian's truck, and probably more than everything Sebastian owned combined. And then his headlights swept across the figure standing beside it, and Sebastian's foot came off the gas on pure animal instinct. The man was enormous. That was the first word that arrived in Sebastian's mind, and it didn't leave room for anything else for a full second. He was wearing a black leather vest over a long-sleeved thermal, no jacket despite the temperature, and his arms, his bare forearms, were covered in tattoos so dense they looked like sleeves made of ink. He was over 6 feet and built like someone who had spent decades doing physical work that didn't care about your comfort. And when Sebastian's headlights caught his face, the man's expression was not the expression of someone who wanted help. It was the expression of someone trapped between rage and desperation, and doing a very poor job of hiding which one was winning. Sebastian's foot came back to the gas. The truck's speed held. The motorcycle was already almost behind him when his eyes caught the patch. He'd seen it before. Everybody out here had seen it. The Death's Head, the 2 words arching above and below it. Hell's Angels. The patch was white on black, and even at distance at night, traveling at 52 miles an hour, Sebastian Bennett had no trouble reading it because that patch was designed to be read. It was designed to be seen and registered and remembered. It was doing its job. Sebastian's foot stayed on the watch for 3 seconds, then he pulled over. He wasn't sure later, when he tried to reconstruct it honestly, that he could explain why. He'd heard every story there was to hear about outlaw motorcycle clubs. He'd lived in the high desert his whole life, and you didn't live out here without absorbing the reality of these clubs the way you absorb the heat gradually, thoroughly, and without being asked. He knew what the patch meant. He knew what the territory meant. He knew that a man wearing that vest on a dark highway at midnight was not a man who needed a 62-year-old school janitor's help. But he also knew what it looked like when a man was out of options. He'd worn that look himself more times than he cared to count. He'd worn it the night Evelyn went into the hospital the second time, and the doctor pulled him into the hallway and said words that Sebastian's mind had simply refused to process for the first 30 seconds because the brain protects itself that way. He'd worn it the morning he sat in his truck outside the bank after they told him the house was gone and there was nothing left to dispute. He knew the geography of that look, the particular way a man's jaw set, and his eyes went somewhere just past the middle distance when he was running out of time and running out of choices, and the thing he needed most was the one thing he couldn't manufacture on his own. Sebastian put the truck in reverse and backed up 50 feet along the shoulder, his hazard lights blinking orange into the dark. He sat there for a moment with the engine idling. He could feel the fuel gauge's invisible pressure, the knowledge that every idle minute was a fraction of a mile he wouldn't have later. He could feel the cold coming in around the edges of the door seal. He could feel the bungee cord back there holding down the jerry can and the weight of what that jerry can represented. He got out. The cold hit him like something with an opinion about him personally. 29 degrees and a wind coming in from the northwest that cut straight through his Carhartt jacket like the jacket wasn't there. He shoved his hands in his pockets and walked back toward the motorcycle, and the man standing beside it turned to watch him come and didn't move and didn't speak. Up close, he was even bigger. Sebastian was 5'9" on a good day, and this man had 5 or 6 inches on him, plus a physical density that made Sebastian feel for just a moment like he was standing next to a wall that had decided to be a person. The Death's Head patch was right there at chest level, clean and clear, and above it on the left breast, a name patch. Iron Mike. "You need help," Sebastian said. The man stared at him. His eyes were dark gray, the color of concrete, and they were doing a full assessment of Sebastian in about 2 seconds, taking in the old jacket, the worn boots, the truck with the garbage bag window, the face of a man who clearly was not a threat and was probably not going to be useful either. "You got jumper cables," the man said. His voice was low and rough, like gravel shifting inside a drum. "I do," Sebastian said, "but I'm guessing that's not your problem." The man's jaw moved. Something shifted in his expression. "No," he said, "it's not." Fuel. A pause, the kind of pause that costs something. "Line cracked," the man said. "Lost pressure somewhere around Baker. Engine died 8 miles back. I pushed it up here." He paused again. "Fuel's not the whole problem, but it's part of it." Sebastian looked at the Harley. Even in the dark, he could see it was a beautiful machine, a Road King he thought maybe a 2018 or 2019 custom painted with a deep charcoal finish that had probably looked like a piece of art under any kind of real light. Now it just looked stranded. "Where are you trying to get to, Barstow?" the man said. "Mercy General." Sebastian's chest did something involuntary at the name. Mercy General was where Evelyn had died. He'd sat in the parking lot of Mercy General at 3 in the morning, eating a vending machine sandwich, because he hadn't been able to make himself go back inside, and he'd looked up at the building's lit windows and tried to understand how something so important could happen in a place that looked so ordinary. "Hospital," Sebastian said. "My brother," the man said. He said it like the two words cost him something he didn't have a reserve of. He had a cardiac event 3 hours ago. They got him stable, but he stopped. He looked away from Sebastian out at the highway at nothing. "I need to get there." Sebastian stood very still in the cold. He knew every logical reason to get back in his truck. He counted them the way you count steps down a dark staircase, carefully making sure you don't miss any. His fuel situation was critical. His truck could not be stranded out here. He had nowhere to call and no money for a tow. He did not know this man. This man was by every reasonable metric someone Sebastian had been implicitly warned about by circumstance and reputation in simple geography for his entire adult life. The jerry can in the back of his truck represented the only margin he had between getting to work on Thursday and losing the job he could not afford to lose. He counted every reason. Then he said, "Let me get my jerry can." The man turned back to look at him. Something moved across his face, not softness exactly, but a reorganization, like furniture shifting in a room. "How much you got?" he said. "Little over a gallon." "That'll get me there if the line holds enough." The man reached into his vest pocket, and Sebastian heard the sound of paper bills, not a card, cash pulled out in the dark. "How much? I'll pay you, whatever you need." "Put that away," Sebastian said. The man stopped. "What?" "I said put it away." Sebastian was already walking back to his truck, already reaching over the side of the bed for the bungee cord. "Some things you don't put a price on. You got a brother in the hospital, you need to get there. That's the situation. Let's deal with the situation." He heard the man's boots on the gravel behind him, and he didn't turn around. "You don't know me," the man said. "No," Sebastian agreed. He unhooked the bungee cord and lifted the jerry can. It was heavier than it looked, or maybe he was tireder than he'd realized. "I don't. You know what that patch means. I know what people say it means." Sebastian turned around with the jerry can in both hands. "You got a dying brother and a broken bike on a cold highway. That's what I know about you right now." Iron Mike Gallagher, because that was his name, as Sebastian would learn in the next few minutes, looked at the old man standing in front of him, holding a red plastic jerry can like it was something precious, which it was, and he was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough to have its own weather. "You got a name," he finally said. "Sebastian." "Sebastian." He said it like he was reading it off a page, testing how it sat. "I'm Mike." "I know," Sebastian said, nodding at the name patch. "Come on, show me where the cap is." They walked back to the Harley together, Sebastian carrying the jerry can, Mike moving with a deliberate care that Sebastian recognized as controlled urgency, the way a man walks when he's forcing himself not to run. Mike crouched beside the fuel tank, and Sebastian crouched with him, and they worked together without talking much, which was how Sebastian preferred to do most things. He could see the cracked fuel line, a hairline fracture just above the lower fitting, the kind of thing that probably started as a stress crack and got worse with the cold. It wasn't going to hold under any real pressure, but light fuel delivery might push enough through to run if they were careful about it, and Mike kept his RPM down. "You know bikes," Mike said. "Little bit. Rode an old Sportster for about 6 years back in the 90s. Sebastian studied the crack. "If you keep it under 2,500 revolutions per minute and don't open it up, this might hold long enough, maybe." Mike looked at him with an expression that was doing several things at once. "You sure you want to give up your fuel for a maybe?" Sebastian looked up from the bike. "Your brother's name," he said. "What is it?" Mike blinked. "Danny." "Then yeah," Sebastian said and started pouring. "I'm sure." The fuel went in slowly, carefully, Sebastian tilting the jerry can at an angle that minimized the pressure on the crack line. The smell of gasoline rose up sharp and cold in the night air. Mike held a flashlight he'd produced from somewhere, a small tactical light, bright and steady, and neither of them said anything for a while. Sebastian was thinking about a lot of things. He was thinking about Thursday morning and the look on Principal Dawes' face if he showed up late for the second time this semester. He was thinking about the tow that would cost $300 he didn't have if the truck died out here. He was thinking about Evelyn, the way he always thought about Evelyn, in the particular quiet of late night, not the end of it, but the beginning. The woman she'd been before the hospital, before the years of fighting, the woman who used to make him pull over for stranded motorists because she said, "You never know what someone's going through, Sebastian. You just never know." He finished pouring. He tilted the jerry can upside down over the tank and waited for the last drops to fall. Then he set it down on the gravel and straightened up, and his knees registered their opinion of the cold with some clarity. Mike was looking at him. "I'm going to ask you something," Mike said, "and I want you to answer me straight." "All right, and why did you stop?" Sebastian picked up the empty jerry can. He thought about it. He thought about the 3 seconds with his foot on the ice and the reflective strip and the patch and all the reasons lined up like fence posts. "I don't know exactly," he said, which was the truest answer he had, "but I know what it looks like when a man needs to get somewhere and can't. And I know what it feels like to have somebody just drive past you when you're in that place." He looked at Mike. "I didn't want to be that person." Mike Gallagher had been a Hell's Angel for 23 years. He had been in situations that most people could not imagine and had come out of them intact, which required a certain kind of hardness that he'd built up so gradually over so many years that he'd mostly stopped noticing it was there. He was not a sentimental man. He was not a man who was easily moved. He stood on the shoulder of Highway 155 in 29-degree weather, and he looked at a 62-year-old school janitor holding an empty red plastic jerry can, and something behind his eyes shifted in a way it hadn't shifted in a very long time. "Start her up," Sebastian said. Mike swung his leg over the Harley. The engine caught on the second try, a deep rolling rumble that sounded healthy enough, all things considered. Mike listened to it with his head slightly tilted, the way you listen to something you love and are worried about at the same time. "She'll run," he said. "Keep it gentle," Sebastian said. "Under 2,500. You push it, and that line's going to let go." "I know." Mike put the bike in gear. He looked at Sebastian. "Where you headed?" "Back to Barstow, same direction." "You got enough fuel to make it?" Sebastian glanced back at his truck. The fuel gauge swam in his memory, the needle buried against the red peg, the little blinking snowflake. He did the math the way he always did his math, which was honestly and without optimism. "I'll figure it out," he said. Mike looked at him for a long moment. "I owe you," he said. It was not the casual version of that phrase. It was the other version, the one that means something specific said by a specific kind of man in a specific kind of world where those words carry actual weight. "You don't owe me anything," Sebastian said. "Go be with your brother." Mike pulled the bike forward onto the highway. He rolled it slowly, gently, the engine purring low and careful. He got 50 feet down the road and stopped. He looked back over his shoulder at Sebastian standing alone on the shoulder with the empty jerry can and the truck with the garbage bag window. He looked at him for a moment. Then he turned back to the road and rode away, and the darkness closed around the taillight like it had never been there. Sebastian stood and listened to the engine note fade until there was nothing but the wind and the cold and the sound of his own breathing. He stood there a little longer than was strictly necessary. Then he got back in his truck, set the empty jerry can on the passenger's seat beside him, and looked at the fuel gauge. He did the math one more time. It wasn't good math. He put the truck in drive. The road ahead was empty and dark and very long. And Sebastian Bennett drove into it alone, the heater warming his left side, his right knee going numb again, and somewhere behind his ribs a feeling he hadn't felt in a while, something small and quiet and stubborn, like an ember that wasn't ready to go out. He didn't know what was coming. He didn't know about the phone call Mike Gallagher would make before he even reached the Barstow city limits. He didn't know about the conversation that would happen in a clubhouse he'd never seen among men whose names he'd never heard, about a janitor on a dark highway who'd given away his last gallon without asking for a single thing in return. He didn't know any of that. He just drove. And the night held everything he'd given away and everything that was still somehow coming back to him. The truck died 4 miles from Barstow. Not dramatically, not with a sputter or a cough or any of the warning signs Sebastian had been listening for. It just quit the engine, going silent, Between one breath and the next, the power steering, locking up the dashboard lights flickering once and then going dark, and Sebastian had just enough momentum to coast onto the shoulder before the truck rolled to a stop with a sound like a long, tired exhale. He sat there for a moment with both hands still on the wheel. "Okay," he said out loud, to nobody, to the truck, to whatever was listening on the other end of a highway at 12:15 in the morning. "Okay." He tried the ignition twice. The engine turned over both times without catching, which meant he had just enough battery left to confirm what he already knew. He wasn't going anywhere. 4 miles from town. 29 degrees, no phone signal. He'd been watching the bars drop for the last 20 minutes. And they'd finally given up entirely somewhere around mile marker 12, and a walk that was going to take him the better part of 2 hours in the cold and the dark. He got out of the truck. He took the empty jerry can because it felt wrong to leave it. He locked the doors out of habit, which struck him, even in the moment, as a slightly absurd thing to do. He turned up his collar against the wind, and he started walking. The thing about walking a highway at night, alone in the cold, was that it gave you time to think. Sebastian had never been afraid of thinking. Some men his age had filled every quiet moment with noise, television, radio, the hum of other people's lives piped in through any available channel, because the silence got too loud when they got older and the losses started stacking up. Sebastian had never been that kind of man. Evelyn used to say he could sit in a quiet room longer than anyone she'd ever met. She said it like a compliment, which he appreciated, though he suspected it was more complicated than that. He walked and he thought about Mike Gallagher riding south on the same road, nursing the engine, keeping the RPM gentle racing toward a hospital, where his brother was either getting better or getting worse, and there was nothing Mike could do about which one it was except get there. He thought about what that was like, that specific helplessness. He knew it intimately. When Evelyn had her first event, he'd been at work. He'd gotten the call from the neighbor, Mrs. Pacheco, who had seen the ambulance and found his number on the refrigerator, where Evelyn kept emergency contacts because Evelyn was that kind of woman, organized, prepared, always thinking about what happened next. Sebastian had driven to Mercy General doing 70 in a 45, and he'd sat in the waiting room for 3 hours before anyone told him anything. And in those 3 hours, he had aged in ways he couldn't fully account for afterward. He'd walked in with one version of himself and walked out with a slightly older, slightly more worn one, and over the next 2 years, that process had continued until Evelyn was gone and Sebastian was 60 years old and learning how to grocery shop for one. He understood Mike Gallagher's urgency. He understood it in his body in the place below the sternum where dread lived. The wind picked up. Sebastian put his head down and kept walking. He'd been going about 40 minutes when he heard the vehicle. He heard it before he saw it, a deep rolling sound coming up from behind, different from a car engine, too rhythmic and full. He turned around and saw the single headlight, and his whole chest tightened, because for one disorienting second he thought Mike had turned around. Then the light resolved into something bigger, and then 2 more lights appeared behind it, and Sebastian realized he wasn't looking at one motorcycle. He was looking at 6. They rolled past him, slower than they needed to, slow enough to be deliberate, and Sebastian held the empty jerry can and watched them pass. The riders didn't look at him, or maybe they did, and he just couldn't tell with the dark and the helmets. The last bike in the column rolled past, and Sebastian turned back to face the road ahead. He heard the engines change pitch behind him. He looked back. All 6 bikes had pulled over. They were sitting on the shoulder about 100 feet ahead, engines idling, and none of the riders had moved. Sebastian stopped walking. For a moment, nobody did anything. The wind moved through the space between them, and the exhaust from 6 pipes curled up into the cold air, and Sebastian stood on the center line with his empty jerry can and waited to find out what was happening. The rider on the last bike got off. He was shorter than Mike most people were, and he walked back towards Sebastian with his hands visible and his pace unhurried, which Sebastian read as a deliberate communication. "You, Sebastian," the man said. Sebastian felt something move through him. "I am." Mike called ahead. The man stopped 6 feet away. He had a beard going gray at the edges and eyes that were doing the same kind of assessment Mike's had done, but with a different quality to it, less suspicious, more like a man reading a situation and trying to understand it correctly. "Said you were going to be on this road on foot. Said we should find you." Sebastian looked at the man. He looked at the 5 other bikes still idling on the shoulder. Howdy call, I haven't had signal since mile marker 12. Satellite phone, the man said. Club equipment. He paused. My name's Ray. I'm the road captain for this chapter. Another pause. What chapter you're not asking, so I'll tell you. San Bernardino. Sebastian nodded slowly. We're going to give you a ride into town, Ray said. Mike's request. I'm all right, Sebastian said, which was not entirely accurate. Ray looked at the jerry can. He looked at Sebastian's boots, which were not made for extended walking in this temperature. He looked at Sebastian's face. With respect, Ray said, you're 4 miles from town and 29 degrees at 12:30 in the morning. You're not all right. He said it without edge, the way you tell someone a true thing without needing them to be embarrassed about it. We've got a spare seat. Let us take you in. Sebastian looked at the bikes. He hadn't been on a motorcycle in nearly 15 years. His last ride had been on that old Sportster he'd sold when Evelyn's medical bills started building and they needed the cash. And he'd told himself he'd buy another one someday, and someday had never come the way someday usually didn't. My truck's back there, he said. We know, Ray said. Mike told us the mile marker. We'll get somebody out here for it tomorrow. I can't afford a tow, Sebastian said, because he was a man who stated the facts of his situation without dressing them up. Ray nodded. That's not going to be your problem, he said simply. Come on. There was something in the man's tone that was hard to argue with. Not forced, nothing like that, just certainty, the same quiet certainty Sebastian had been raised to recognize in people who said what they meant and meant what they said. He'd spent 62 years trying to be that kind of person himself. He got on the back of Ray's bike. The ride into Barstow took 11 minutes. Sebastian held the jerry can between his knees with one hand gripped on the passenger handle and watched the desert slide past on either side and felt the cold hitting him differently at speed, more total, more committed, the kind of cold that didn't negotiate. But the bike was steady and Ray rode it well, and Sebastian found himself thinking, despite everything, that he'd missed this. The way a motorcycle puts you in contact with the road rather than insulating you from it. The way the engine communicated through your whole body. They dropped him at the corner of First and Williams, 2 blocks from Desert Pines. Ray pulled up to the curb and Sebastian climbed off a little stiff and stood on the sidewalk with the empty jerry can. You need anything else tonight? Ray said. No, Sebastian said. Thank you for the ride. Thank you, Ray said, for what you did out there. He said it directly without ceremony, looking at Sebastian without looking away. Then he pulled the bike back out into the street, and the 6 of them rolled away into the town, and the sound faded, and Sebastian was alone on a Barstow sidewalk at 12:41 in the morning. He walked the 2 blocks to Desert Pines and let himself into his trailer and set the empty jerry can by the door and sat down at his kitchen table without taking his jacket off. He sat there for a while. Then he got up, opened the kitchen drawer, and counted the envelope. $63 and some change. He put it back. He looked at the phone on the counter. He had signal here, enough to make a call, and he thought about calling his daughter to tell her what had happened. Then he thought about what he'd say. He didn't know how to tell it in a way that didn't sound like either a complaint or a boast, and Carla had enough to think about with the kids and the mortgage and her husband's hours getting cut. So he left the phone where it was. He went to bed at 1 in the morning. He was up at 5:15 because that was when he was always up and his body had stopped needing an alarm clock sometime in the past decade. He showered in water that took 3 minutes to get warm, dressed in his uniform, ate a bowl of oatmeal, standing at the counter, and went to the window to look at where his truck was supposed to be. The space was empty. He had a moment, just a moment, of the specific dread that comes from seeing what should be there and finding nothing. Then he remembered. The truck was 4 miles out on Highway 155. He had no way to get to work. Work started at 6:30. He called the school's main line and got the answering service and left a message for Principal Dawes explaining that his truck had broken down and he would be late. He used the word late deliberately, not absent, because late implied coming and absent implied a question. He did not have money for a cab. He looked up the bus schedule on his phone and discovered that the first bus going in the direction of Ridgeline didn't run until 7:15, which would get him there at 7:50, which was an hour and 20 minutes after his shift started. This was the second time in 7 weeks he'd been late. The first time Dawes had sat him down in that office with the motivational posters and the artificial plant and told him that his position required dependability and that he hoped Sebastian understood that the school district took punctuality seriously. Sebastian understood. He had been understanding things like that his entire working life. He put on his jacket and walked to the bus stop. He waited 41 minutes in the cold before the bus came. He rode it for 35 minutes. He walked the remaining 6 blocks to Ridgeline Elementary and arrived at 7:47, 1 hour and 17 minutes after his shift started. He went straight to his supply closet, clocked in, and started on the hallway floors because the hallway floors were what needed doing, and standing around thinking about what was coming wasn't going to change what was coming. Principal Linda Dawes found him at 8:20. He heard her footsteps. She wore low heels that clicked on the linoleum in a particular way he'd learned to recognize, and he straightened up from the mop cart and waited. She was 51 trim, with reading glasses on a chain around her neck that she touched when she was about to say something she'd already decided. She was touching them now. "Sebastian," she said. "I know," he said. "This is the second time this semester." "I know. I received your message. I understand your truck broke down." She paused. "I do want you to know that I understand that, and I'm sorry about it." He waited because there was more. "But I have to be honest with you," she said. "The district has been asking me to review our support staff hours. Attendance and punctuality are part of that review." She touched the glasses again. "I don't want to do this, Sebastian. I want you to know that." "But you're going to," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "I'm going to have to put you on a written warning," she said. "One more incident within the next 90 days, and I'll be required to submit a termination recommendation to the district." Sebastian held the mop handle. He thought about the $63 in the envelope. He thought about the jerry can empty by his front door. "All right," he said. "I'm sorry," she said, and he could tell she meant it, which somehow made it marginally worse and marginally better at the same time. She left. Sebastian went back to mopping. He worked his full shift. He mopped every hallway, cleaned every bathroom, replaced 3 burned-out bulbs, fixed a stuck locker door with a screwdriver and patience, and swept the cafeteria after lunch. He did all of it the way he'd done it for 11 years thoroughly without complaint, because this was his job, and he was a man who did his job even when his job was trying to become the thing that finished him. At 3:15, he got a call from a number he didn't recognize. He almost didn't answer. Unknown numbers out here were usually either debt collectors or robocalls about his car's extended warranty, and he didn't have the energy for either. But something made him pick up. Maybe it was the previous night still sitting in him, making him more open than usual to things he couldn't predict. "Sebastian Bennett." The voice was deep and careful. "Speaking. My name is Frank Dutton. I'm a club officer with the San Bernardino chapter. I spoke with Ray this morning." A pause. "And with Iron Mike." Sebastian stood in the hallway outside the cafeteria with the mop cart beside him and the institutional smell of the school wall all around him. "Okay, I thought I'm on," he said. "Mike wanted me to call and I'd check on you personally. He said you were on foot last night after giving him your fuel. He wanted to know you got home." "I got home," Sebastian said. "Your men gave me a ride in, Ray." "I know, he told me." Another pause. "How's your truck?" "Still out on 155. I don't have—" He stopped. He started again. "I haven't figured out the truck yet." "Don't worry about the truck," Frank said. "We're sending someone out this morning. You'll have it back." "I can't pay for a tow," Sebastian said. "I appreciate the thought, but I need to be straightforward with you about that." "Sebastian," Frank's voice was patient. "Nobody's asking you to pay for anything. We're handling it. That's what this call is." Sebastian was quiet for a moment. He thought about how to say the thing he needed to say. "Mr. Dutton," he said, "I didn't help Mike because I wanted something back. I want you to know that." "I know that," Frank said. "That's exactly why we're doing this." Sebastian stood with the phone and thought about that sentence for a moment. The logic of it, the way it turned what he'd done into something that came back differently than he'd given it, not as a transaction, not as a favor waiting to be balanced, but as something else, something he didn't quite have a word for yet. "How's his brother?" Sebastian said. "Danny." A pause. Something shifted in the quality of Frank's silence. "Danny's alive," he said. "Mike got there in time. The doctor said another 20, 30 minutes, and it would have been a different conversation." He paused again. "Mike told us what you did. He told the whole chapter last night. He told them about the jerry can and what you said and how you wouldn't take money. Frank's voice was careful with the next part, like he was handling something fragile. He said you told him some things you can't put a price on. Sebastian closed his eyes for a second. He hadn't thought about those words since he said them. They just come out, the kind of thing you say when you stop performing and start just talking. That's what I believe, Sebastian said. So do we, Frank said. Get some rest tonight, Sebastian. Your truck will be back at your place by end of day tomorrow, and we'll be in touch. The call ended. Sebastian put his phone in his pocket and stood in the hallway for a moment. In the clubhouse in San Bernardino, the conversation that had already started was still going. 14 men around a table, some of them having ridden the night before, and some of them getting the story secondhand, but all of them sitting with the same image in their heads, a 62-year-old janitor on a dark highway, handing over his last gallon of fuel to a stranger he had every reason to fear refusing the money, saying, "Go be with your brother," and meaning it down to the bone. Men who had spent their lives inside a code that most of the outside world misunderstood knew what they were looking at when they heard that story. They knew the shape of it. They knew the weight of it. He didn't ask for anything, Mike said. He'd been at the hospital all night and he hadn't slept, and his eyes showed it, but his voice was steady. Not a thing. He's sitting there with an empty tank and he won't take my money. And he says, "Go be with your brother," like it's the most natural thing in the world. Nobody said anything for a moment. "What's his situation?" someone asked. Mike had spent part of the morning making calls. He'd talked to Ray, who talked to people in Barstow, and the picture that assembled itself was not a comfortable one. Sebastian Bennett, 62, widower school janitor, single credit card debt, in collections truck, breaking down trailer park, $63 to his name, and a written warning on his employment record. "He's got nothing," Mike said. "He gave us nothing, and he's got nothing." The room held that. Frank Dutton, who had been a Hell's Angel for 29 years and had seen more kinds of people than most people knew existed, looked around the table at the men he'd ridden with through decades of history. "Then we fix it," he said. "It wasn't a vote. It didn't need to be." What nobody around that table said out loud, because it didn't need to be said, was that this wasn't charity. Charity was something you gave downwards, something that implied a gap between giver and receiver. What Sebastian Bennett had done on Highway 155 at midnight in the cold had not been charity. It had been something rarer, something these men who measured the world by a strict and private standard recognized immediately. It had been honor. And honor in the world these men lived in was the one currency that was never wasted and never forgotten. Sebastian Bennett went home that evening not knowing any of this. He walked back to Desert Pines because the bus didn't run after 4. He let himself into the trailer and changed out of his uniform and heated up a can of soup on the stove and ate it at the kitchen table. He looked at the empty jerry can by the door. He thought about Mike riding through the dark. He thought about Danny alive in a hospital room. He thought about Ray pulling up to that curb and saying with respect, "You're not all right," and the way it had felt to be seen that clearly by a stranger. He went to bed at 9:30. He didn't know what tomorrow held. He didn't know about the phone calls still being made, the plans taking shape, the wheels turning in a San Bernardino clubhouse while he slept. He just knew that he'd done the right thing out there on the highway. Whatever that cost him, it hadn't cost him that. And somewhere in him, deeper than the debt, in the warning letter, in the empty tank, in the $63 in the envelope, that knowledge sat quiet and solid and warm. He slept 9 hours straight, which he hadn't done in years. Sebastian couldn't remember the last time he'd gone under that completely. No half waking at 3 in the morning, no lying there with the ceiling and the math and the quiet. That got too loud after a while. He just went down and stayed down. And when he opened his eyes, it was 6:40, and the light coming through the trailer's one east-facing window had the particular flat gray quality of a November morning that hadn't decided yet whether it was going to try. He lay there for a moment, orienting. Then he remembered the truck. He got up and went to the window and looked out at the lot. The space where his F-150 should have been was still empty. He'd known it would be. Frank Dutton had said end of day tomorrow, and tomorrow was today, and the day hadn't started yet, but knowing something and seeing the empty space were two different experiences, and his stomach did a small, familiar drop at the sight of it. He made coffee. He stood at the counter with the mug and thought through his options the way he always thought through his options, systematically without drama, because drama didn't change math. Without the truck, he couldn't get to work reliably. The bus got him there late, which was now a documented problem. If he was late one more time in the next 90 days, he lost the job. If he lost the job, he couldn't pay the lot rent. If he couldn't pay the lot rent, he stopped the chain there. He'd learned somewhere in his 50s that following that chain all the way to its end didn't help anything. You dealt with what was in front of you. The truck wasn't there yet. Deal with what was in front of you. What was in front of him was a Thursday with no transportation and a shift that started at 6:30. He called Carla at 6:55. She answered on the third ring, which meant she was already up with the kids, and he could hear Marcus in the background asking about cereal in the particular controlled chaos of a house with two children under 7 getting ready for school. Dad. Her voice had the edge it always had when he called at unexpected times. Not annoyance, just a readiness for bad news, which he trained into her without meaning to over the years of unexpected bad news. I need to ask a favor, he said. I need a ride to work this morning. A pause while she processed this. Your truck, it broke down last night out on 155. Dad, how did you get home? He thought about how to answer that. Some people gave me a ride, he said. What people? I'll tell you the whole thing later. Can you get me to Ridgeline by 6:30? Another pause longer. He could hear her calculating Marcus's school, the baby's schedule, her own commute. He hated asking. He'd spent a significant portion of his adult life structuring things so he wouldn't have to ask Carla for things, not because she wouldn't help, but because she had enough and he knew it. I can do 6:20, she said, but I can't wait around. I have to drop Marcus by 7. 6:20 is perfect, he said, thank you. She pulled up at 6:18 in the minivan with Marcus in the back seat in his booster and the baby asleep in the infant seat and a travel mug of coffee she handed him through the window before he had even gotten the door fully open. Take it, she said. You look terrible. Thank you, he said, and he wasn't sure whether he was thanking her for the coffee or the honesty. They drove toward Ridgeline, and Marcus asked 3 questions about whether dinosaurs could ride motorcycles, and Carla answered the first 2 and ignored the third, and Sebastian sat with the coffee and watched the town go past and felt, as he sometimes did in the presence of his daughter and her children, a complicated mixture of gratitude and inadequacy that he'd never found a way to fully resolve. Tell me what happened, Carla said. Not a request. She'd always had that quality, asking things the way people stated facts. He told her. The fuel gauge, the motorcycle on the shoulder, the patch mic, the jerry can. He kept it factual and brief, and he watched her expression change in the way her mother's used to change when he told her something she wasn't sure how to respond to, that slight tightening the lips going together. You gave your last fuel, she said to a Hell's Angel. He needed to get to his brother. Dad. She said it in a specific way that contained several complete sentences. His brother was dying, Carla. And if he'd been a different kind of person, she stopped, started again. You don't know what those people are capable of. I know what that man was capable of that night, Sebastian said. He was capable of needing to get to his brother. That's what I knew. Carla was quiet for a moment. Marcus had moved on from dinosaurs to something about a kid named Bryson at school talking to himself in the back seat with perfect contentment. Mom would have done the same thing, Carla said finally. Sebastian looked at his coffee. Yeah, he said. She would have. Carla dropped him at the front entrance at 6:27, and he made it to the supply closet and clocked in at 6:29, which was technically on time, and he felt the relief of that in his legs more than anywhere. He went to work. The morning moved the way school mornings move, fast in some ways and slow in others, with the particular rhythm of an institution that had its own internal clock. Kids arrived. Hallways got loud. A second grader knocked over a half-full chocolate milk carton in the east corridor, and Sebastian was there with a mop inside 4 minutes, which was a personal record. He liked being good at his job. He didn't say that to people because it didn't sound like the kind of thing a person was supposed to take pride in, but he'd always believed that the worth of work came from how well you did it, not from what the work was called. At 10:15, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Unknown number. He almost let it go. He was in the middle of replacing a paper towel dispenser in the boys' bathroom, and he had 3 screws in his hand, but he put the screws in his shirt pocket and answered. Sebastian, it was Frank Dutton's voice even, and measured the same way it had been the day before. Mr. Dutton, your truck, Frank said. Our guys picked it up this morning. We've got a mechanic looking at it now. Fuel pump like you thought, plus the fuel line needs replacement. Nothing catastrophic. A pause. We'll have it back to you tonight. Sebastian was quiet for a moment, the paper towel dispenser half mounted on the wall in front of him. I told you I can't. Sebastian, Frank said, and there was something in his voice that was not impatience, but was related to it, the tone of a man who needed something to be understood clearly. Are you hearing me? We're handling it. This is not a loan. This is not something you're going to pay back. Are we clear? Sebastian thought about arguing. He'd been raised by a man who didn't accept things from people he didn't know, who'd returned birthday gifts from neighbors when they cost more than seemed right, and who'd driven 3 hours to pay back a $40 loan rather than let it sit unresolved. That training ran deep. It ran in his blood, the same way certain diseases ran in blood, quietly present, always available, surfacing under pressure. But he thought about what Frank had said yesterday. The reason they were doing this was because he hadn't asked for anything. And he understood somewhere below the argument in the pride that refusing now was its own kind of refusal of what had passed between him and Mike on that highway. He'd given something freely. They were giving something freely. The math was the same. We're clear, he said. Good. Frank's voice shifted slightly, less formal, more direct. Mike wants to talk to you tonight if you're available. He's leaving the hospital this afternoon. His brother is going to be all right. Something loosened in Sebastian's chest. That's good news, he said and meant it completely. Yeah, Frank said. It is. The truck arrived at Desert Pines at 4:50 in the afternoon, delivered by a man named Cody who had the specific build and manner of someone who worked on machines for a living and was comfortable with silence. He handed Sebastian the keys without ceremony and said the fuel pump was new, the fuel line was patched and reinforced, the oil had been changed because it needed it, and they'd put $20 of gas in the tank. Sebastian looked at the truck. It was cleaner than when he'd left it on the highway. Someone had wiped down the exterior. Thank you, he said. Cody nodded once and got into the truck that had followed him over a newer Chevy with a younger man at the wheel, and they drove away and Sebastian stood in the lot holding his keys. He sat in the truck for a moment. He turned the key and the engine came up immediately clean and immediate, none of the whining hesitation of the past weeks. He listened to it. It sounded like a truck that intended to keep going. Mike called at 6:30. Sebastian was at the kitchen table eating leftover rice when the phone rang, and he saw the number he didn't recognize and answered it anyway because he'd been answering unknown numbers all day. And that seemed to be working out. It's Mike. The voice was the same gravel and depth, but it had something in it that wasn't there 2 nights ago. A looseness, maybe. The particular quality of a man who has been holding something very tightly and has finally been given permission to let go. How's Danny? Sebastian said. He's going to make it. Mike said it plainly without performance, but the plainness was doing a lot of work. 3 words carrying the weight of everything that might have gone differently. They're saying a week in the hospital, then a month of recovery, but he's going to make it. I'm glad, Sebastian said. A pause. Sebastian, I've been trying to figure out what to say to you since I rode away from you 2 nights ago. Another pause. I'm not. He stopped. Started again. I don't talk about this kind of thing easily. I want you to know that. What you did out there. Mike, let me finish. Not harsh, just firm. I've been riding 23 years. I've met a lot of people on a lot of roads. I've had people help me and people not help me, and I've generally known which one was coming before it happened. He paused. I didn't know which one you were going to be. When I saw your headlights slow down, I don't know what I thought. I thought you were going to roll your window down and take a picture for your phone. I thought you were going to ask if I needed a call and then drive off. I was ready for every version of that. Sebastian listened. You got out of your truck, Mike said. That was the first thing. You got out. And then I saw you walking over and you had that empty can in your hand and your window's got a garbage bag on it and you've got the look of a man who's running on his last reserves, and I thought, he made a short sound, not quite a laugh. I thought this man has no business stopping. Every reason in the world to keep going, and he stopped anyway. Your brother needed. That's not why most people would have stopped, Mike said. You know that. Sebastian didn't argue. I want to meet you, Mike said, in person in daylight. I want to buy you a meal and sit across from you at a table and talk to you like a human being. Would you do that? Sebastian thought about it. He thought about it in the specific way he thought about things that were outside his ordinary perimeter, with a kind of careful attention, turning it over, looking at all the sides. Yeah, he said, I would. Saturday morning there's a diner on Lenwood Road, Edna's. You know it. I know it, Sebastian said. He'd been eating breakfast at Edna's for 11 years. The coffee was reliable, and the portions were honest, and the woman who worked the Saturday morning shift, a 50-year-old named Gloria, had been calling him honey since the second week, and he'd never asked her to stop. 9 o'clock, Mike said, 9 o'clock. After he hung up, Sebastian sat with the phone in his hand for a moment. Outside, the lot was quiet. Someone 3 trailers down had their television on, and he could hear the murmur of it through the thin walls, the rise and fall of a laugh track. The truck was in its space. The jerry can was by the door. He thought about what Mike had said. Every reason in the world to keep going, and he stopped anyway. It hadn't felt like a decision out there on the highway. That was the honest truth of it, the part Sebastian couldn't fully explain even to himself. It hadn't felt like a moral calculation or a moment of courage or any of the things it might look like from the outside. It had felt like recognition, like seeing a thing and knowing what it required of you and not being able to look away from that knowledge. He'd spent 62 years being told in various ways, both direct and indirect, that people like him, broke people quiet, people without rank or consequence, didn't matter very much to the wider world. He'd learned to live inside that knowledge without letting it make him smaller than he was. But it was always there, the awareness of his own edges, the knowledge of where he stopped counting. What nobody had ever told him, what he was only beginning to understand now, sitting in a trailer with rice going cold on the table and the sound of a neighbor's television coming through the wall, was that sometimes the moment when you mattered most was exactly the moment when you had the least. He went to bed at 9:15 and he slept well again. Friday passed without incident, which felt significant given how Friday had been preceding it. He got to work on time, did his shift, came home, ate, watched 40 minutes of television, and went to bed feeling something he hadn't felt in a while. Not happiness exactly, but the precursor to it. The sense that the air was clearing somewhere ahead. Saturday morning, he drove the truck to Edna's and parked and went inside at 8:50 and sat in his regular booth, the one by the window that Gloria had started keeping open for him sometime in the past 5 years without either of them acknowledging the arrangement. She brought his coffee before he asked. You look different, she said, studying him. Something around your eyes. She tilted her head. Like you slept. I did sleep, he said. She considered this. Good, she said, and went to get someone else's order. Mike arrived at 9:03. Sebastian saw him before he came through the door, saw him through the window, crossing the parking lot, moving with that same controlled purposefulness Sebastian had observed on the highway. He was in civilian clothes, jeans, a thermal, a jacket, and without the vest and the dark and the adrenaline, he looked different. Still big, still capable of filling a room with his presence alone, but more human than Sebastian's memory of him had allowed. He came in and looked around and found Sebastian and crossed to the booth and put out his hand. Sebastian shook it. They sat across from each other in the morning light of Edna's diner while Gloria came and poured Mike's coffee without asking and left them to it, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Sebastian thought about all the places a conversation like this could start and waited to find out where Mike would choose. Danny called me this morning, Mike said, from his hospital room. He's been trying to get on his phone since yesterday, but they keep taking it away from him. He looked at his coffee. He asked me to tell you thank you. He knows what happened. I told him. He looked up. He cried. I want you to know that. My brother is not a man who cries easily, and he cried. Sebastian wrapped his hands around his mug. How old is he? He said. 56, Mike paused. 6 years younger than me. He's got 3 grandkids. The youngest one is 4 months old. He said this without sentiment, but with a precision that conveyed exactly what was underneath it, the calculation of what had almost been lost. That baby almost grew up without knowing her grandfather. You understand what I'm saying? Sebastian understood. I need to tell you something else, Mike said. He set his mug down. He looked at Sebastian directly, the same gray-bright eyes that had assessed him on the highway, but doing something different now, something more considered. The chapter talked. All of us. We talked about you and about what you did and about what that means. Sebastian started to say something. I know what you're going to say, Mike said. You didn't do it for a reward. You didn't do it to start a relationship with us. You did it because a man needed help and you had what he needed and you gave it." He paused. "That's exactly what we talked about. Exactly that." Sebastian waited. "We're coming to see you," Mike said. "The chapter, tomorrow morning." He held Sebastian's eyes. "Not just our chapter. We put the word out." Sebastian felt something shift in him, an alertness, not quite alarm, but related to it. "What do you mean, put the word out?" "I mean, there are people coming in from 3 chapters," Mike said simply. "San Bernardino, Riverside, Barstow, and some independent writers who heard the story through channels." He paused. "A lot of people, Sebastian." Sebastian looked at him. "How many people?" "How?" Mike was quiet for a moment. He turned his coffee mug a quarter turn on the table, a deliberate, unhurried movement. "A lot," he said again, and something in his eyes said he wasn't going to give a number yet, and something in the set of his jaw said the number would answer for itself tomorrow morning. Sebastian sat with that. He thought about Desert Pines, the narrow lanes between the trailers, the neighbors who kept early hours old, Mr. Ketterman in the lot to his left, who was 78 and had a heart that didn't like surprises, the park manager Dave, who had an official policy about gatherings of more than 6 people that he applied with the enthusiasm of a man who had very little else to feel official about. "Mike," Sebastian said carefully, "my neighbors." "We'll be respectful," Mike said. "I give you my word on that." Sebastian looked at him. He thought about a word given on a dark highway by a man who had then ridden away into the night and kept it in every measurable way. He thought about the truck in his space running cleaner than it had in 2 years. "All right," he said. They sat and ate breakfast and talked for 2 hours. Not about the highway, not about the chapter, not about tomorrow. They talked the way 2 men talk when they're actually finding out about each other. Mike's early years in Fresno, his father's machine shop, the way he'd come to the club, not through any dramatic recruitment, but through a series of small gravitational pulls toward people who had a code he could understand. Sebastian talked about Evelyn, about Carla, about the Sportster he'd sold in 2008, and how he still thought about it sometimes when the light was right in the morning. Mike listened to all of it with the full unperformed attention of a man who had spent decades learning to read people and had learned that the reading happened in the quiet more than the noise. When they stood to leave, Mike picked up the check before Sebastian touched it. Sebastian didn't fight him on it. They stood by the door and Mike put out his hand again. Sebastian shook it again, and this time the handshake lasted a beat longer, the way handshakes do when they're finishing something and starting something at the same time. "Tomorrow morning," Mike said, "early." "How early?" Sebastian said. Mike almost smiled. It moved across his face and then retreated, but it was there. "You'll hear us coming," he said. He went through the door. Sebastian watched him cross the parking lot and get onto the bike, a different one, a rental or borrowed, he figured, while his own was being repaired, and ride away. Sebastian stood in the doorway of Edna's Diner on Lenwood Road on a Saturday morning in November and thought about what early meant and what a lot meant and what the sound of it was going to be. He drove home and went to sleep at 9:30 with his alarm set for 6, and he lay in the dark for a long time before he went under, listening to the quiet of the trailer park, to the last ordinary silence it would have for a while. He didn't know exactly what was coming. He knew the shape of it, the general architecture, but the full weight of it, the meaning of it, the way it was going to land on him and on this street and on every ordinary thing he'd built his ordinary life around that he couldn't know yet. Tomorrow would tell him. He heard them at 6:12. His alarm was set for 6, but he'd been awake since 5:40, lying on his back in the dark, with his eyes open, listening to the trailer park, the way you listen to a thing you know is about to change. The lot had its own sounds at that hour. Mr. Ketterman's radio coming on at 5:30 like clockwork, the Delgado family's dog doing its morning complaint about nothing, the particular creak of the lot's gravel when the temperature shifted between night and day. Sebastian knew all of it. He'd been sleeping inside these sounds for 6 years. At 6:12, something different arrived underneath all of it. It was low at first, more felt than heard, a vibration that reached him through the trailer's thin floor before his ears confirmed what it was. Then it built, and it kept building, and it didn't stop building the way a single engine or even 3 or 4 engines would have stopped building. This kept coming, layer over layer, like thunder that had decided to stay. Sebastian sat up. He sat on the edge of his bed in his undershirt and work pants and listened to the sound grow until it was no longer a sound from somewhere else, but a sound that was here, that was surrounding the trailer park. The way weather surrounded it, total and directional, and impossible to locate to a single point because it was coming from every point at once. He put on his flannel shirt. He put on his boots. His hands were steady doing this, which surprised him a little. He opened the front door. The sound hit him fully, a rolling, layered thunder of engines that he felt in his sternum and his back teeth simultaneously. The lane in front of his trailer was empty, but he could hear them on the main road that ran along the park's east perimeter, and he could hear people waking up. Lights coming on in trailers. Voices. Mr. Ketterman's radio going silent, which meant the old man had turned it off to listen. His phone buzzed. Mike. Step outside, Mike said. Walk to the main entrance. I'm already outside, Sebastian said. Then walk toward the sound. He walked. The lane from his trailer to the main entrance of Desert Pines was about 200 feet, and Sebastian walked it in the early morning light with his phone in his hand and the engine sound getting larger with every step. And by the time he reached the entrance gate, he could see them. They were lined up on the road outside the park in a column that stretched further than Sebastian could see in either direction. Motorcycles side by side, 2 by 2 in some places, engines idling at low throttle. That was the sound, dozens of engines at idle, collectively producing something that was less like noise and more like a physical condition of the air. The morning light caught the chrome and the black metal and the leather and the patches, and Sebastian stood at the entrance gate of his trailer park and looked at it and felt something happen in his chest that he didn't immediately have a name for. Ray was at the front of the column. He saw Sebastian and raised his hand, a simple gesture, and the column behind him went quiet. Engine by engine, in a wave that traveled backward down the column, the throttles came off, and the idling died, and the silence that replaced it was the loudest thing Sebastian had heard in years. It lasted about 4 seconds. Then Ray said to the column behind him, "We're here," and the sound that came back from 200 people wasn't cheering or yelling, but something more deliberate, a low collective acknowledgement, like a room full of people saying yes at the same time. Sebastian stood at the gate and counted and stopped counting because the number kept going. Ray walked his bike through the entrance, first slow and respectful, and the column began to follow in the same measured way, not showing off, not revving, just moving through the entrance of Desert Pines with a kind of deliberate dignity that Sebastian registered and felt grateful for without knowing how to say so. By the time the last bike was through the gate and they were arranged in the lot, filling every open space overflowing back toward the entrance, lining both sides of the main lane, Sebastian could see people coming out of their trailers all through the park. Mrs. Delgado in her housecoat, the Reyes family from the far end, the teenage son recording on his phone. Mr. Ketterman at his door leaning on his walker, squinting out at the lot with an expression Sebastian couldn't read from this distance. Mike came through this column. He walked between the bikes with the ease of a man moving through his own living room, and he was in his full cut, the vest, the patches, the deaths, head clear and present, and he walked straight to Sebastian and stopped in front of him and put out his hand. Sebastian shook it. "You holding up," Mike said. "I don't entirely know what I'm holding up against," Sebastian said. Mike almost smiled, that same thing crossing his face and retreating. "Fair," he said. Behind him, Sebastian could see Frank Dutton moving through the crowd, talking quietly to a few of the riders, doing the organizational work of a man whose job was to make large things happen smoothly. There were road captains Sebastian didn't know, coordinating parking and spacing with an efficiency that impressed him. This had been thought through, he realized. This wasn't a mob or a crowd. This was organized. These people had done things that required logistics before. "How many?" Sebastian said. "Final count was 187, Mike said, plus support." Sebastian absorbed this. "From 3 chapters. From 5, Mike said. Word traveled." Sebastian looked out at the lot. 187 motorcycles and their riders now occupied every available space in Desert Pines and extended back into the road, and the residents of the park were coming out of their trailers one by one and standing in their doorways or on their small stoops and trying to understand what they were witnessing. Dave, the park manager, appeared from the direction of the office at a pace that suggested he'd been alerted by someone and had covered the distance between his office and the main lot faster than his body usually moved. He was a stout man in his late 40s who wore a Desert Pines polo shirt year-round and had a tendency to lead with policy before considering anything else. Sebastian saw him coming and felt a small preemptive weariness. Dave stopped when he reached the edge of the crowd. He looked at the bikes. He looked at the riders. He looked at Sebastian, who was standing in the middle of all of it with Mike Gallagher. Sebastian, Dave said. What there is a park policy regarding Dave, Sebastian said. These are guests of mine. Dave opened his mouth, closed it, looked at Mike Gallagher, who was standing 6'2" with the death's head patch at eye level, and who was looking at Dave with an expression of complete patient neutrality. Dave looked back at Sebastian. All right, he said, and went back the way he came. Something close to actual laughter moved through the riders nearest to them. Not loud, careful, aware of the neighborhood, but real. Mike's mouth moved briefly. Frank Dutton appeared at Mike's shoulder. He was carrying something, and it took Sebastian a moment to understand what he was seeing. It was a set of keys, truck keys from the shape and the fob. Before we get to the main part, Frank said, looking at Sebastian, I want to give you something to hold. He put the keys in Sebastian's hand. Sebastian looked at them. My truck keys, he said. No, Frank said. Look at the fob. Sebastian looked. It was a different logo than his. Newer. He looked up at Frank. We had your truck fixed, Frank said. But we also, he paused, choosing the next word. We decided your truck was done. It was done, Sebastian. That fuel pump was the third thing to go in 6 months, and the frames got rust. That's going to become a safety problem by spring. He said it matter-of-factly, the way a mechanic talks, not apologetic, but informational. So we got you something else. Sebastian stood very still. It's a 2019 F-150, Frank said. 63,000 miles. New tires, new battery. We had one of our guys go through it top to bottom this week. It's clean. The world did something strange for a moment. Sebastian felt it, a kind of tilting, a reorganization of what he'd thought was solid. He looked at the key fob in his palm. He looked at Frank. He looked at Mike. I can't accept a truck, he said. The words came out automatically from somewhere deep in the training his father had given him about debt and obligation and what it meant to take things from people. You're not taking it, Mike said. We're giving it. There's a difference. He said it the same way Sebastian had told him, put the money away on the highway quietly, finally, without room for argument. You gave me something that night that I can't give back. I'm not trying to give it back. I'm trying to do the thing that's right for a man who did a right thing, and you standing here arguing with me is the only part of this that's making it harder. Sebastian looked at the key. He thought about the bus. He thought about calling Carla at 6:50 in the morning and hearing the controlled edge in her voice. He thought about the fuel gauge needle buried against the red peg and the way he'd done that particular math for years. How far to the next paycheck? How close to the edge? How many ways things could break before one of them broke for good? He closed his hand around the key. Thank you, he said. It came out rough. He cleared his throat. Thank you. Frank nodded once. That was enough. But they weren't done. Sebastian would understand this only gradually over the next 30 minutes, as the morning revealed itself piece by piece, the way mornings do when they're carrying more than you expected. A man Sebastian didn't know came forward, 50s, compact, with the hands of someone who worked with them for a living, and introduced himself as Phil. Phil, it turned out, owned an auto parts supply business in San Bernardino, with a warehouse operation and a small fleet of delivery vehicles. We heard about your situation at the school, Phil said. He said it plainly, not unkindly. Your attendance record. The warning. He paused. The issue wasn't you. The issue was you didn't have reliable transportation. That's fixed now. He put a card in Sebastian's hand. I also want you to know that if the school situation doesn't work out, if they push that warning into something it shouldn't be, I've got a facilities position open. Not glamorous, but it pays $22 an hour and has health insurance, and you'd never have a transportation problem because we're 6 blocks from the bus depot. He shook Sebastian's hand. You wouldn't have to take it. I just want you to know it exists. Sebastian looked at the card. He looked at Phil. He tried to say something and found the mechanism wasn't immediately available. Thank you, he managed. Don't thank me, Phil said. Thank yourself. You're the one who stopped. The morning kept going. A woman from the Riverside chapter, she was introduced as Karen Rhodes' secretary, no nonsense in a way Sebastian immediately respected, came forward and presented him with a document. It took him a moment to understand what he was reading. It was the paperwork for a small business. A sole proprietorship already filed with the state in Sebastian's name. The business was a cleaning and maintenance service. Commercial contracts. 3 of them already signed with businesses in Barstow that needed regular maintenance work, an auto shop, a storage facility, and a small medical office complex. The combined contracts represented approximately $1,800 a month. Sebastian read the document twice. He looked up at Karen. "This is real," he said. It wasn't a question. He just needed to say it. "It's real," she said. "The contracts are real. The clients know who you are, and they chose to sign. You can run it alongside your school job, or you can let it grow. That's up to you." She paused. "You'd be your own boss, Sebastian, in the work you already know how to do." Sebastian sat down on the step of someone's trailer because his legs had made a decision his brain hadn't quite caught up to yet. He sat there with the truck key and Phil's card and the business paperwork in his hands, and he looked at the ground for a moment. Nobody rushed him. Nobody said anything. The lot was very quiet for a moment, 187 people holding still, while one man sat on a step and tried to understand what was happening to his life. Carla arrived at 7:20. He'd sent her a text 30 minutes earlier, "Come to the park. Something's happening," because he didn't know how to explain it in words, and he wanted her to see it. She came through the entrance in the minivan and stopped when she saw the bikes and the riders and the crowd of her father's neighbors all standing in the morning cold, watching something she couldn't immediately categorize. She parked and got out and walked through the crowd to where Sebastian was standing, and her expression went through several phases. Confusion, alarm, something searching until she found her father's face and read it. Whatever she saw there settled something in her own. "Dad," she said, "what is all this?" "I don't know how to explain it briefly," he said. She looked at Mike, who was standing nearby. She looked at the patch. Her jaw tightened slightly, the same thing his jaw did when he was holding a reaction, and then she looked back at her father. "Are you okay?" she said. "Yeah," he said. "I really am." She looked at the key in his hand. "What's that?" "A truck key," he said. She waited. "A different truck," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the crowd of riders, at the people from the park standing in their doorways, at the particular quality of the morning, the light, the stillness, the way everyone present seemed to understand that something important was happening and was treating it accordingly. "Mom would have wanted to feed all of them," Carla said. Sebastian laughed. It came out sudden and real and surprised him, and it surprised Carla. And then she laughed too, and Mike, who had heard it, turned toward them with that expression that almost became a smile. "She would have," Sebastian said. "She absolutely would have." Mr. Ketterin made it across the lot on his walker at 7:35, moving with the deliberate determination of a man who had decided he was going to get somewhere and would not be dissuaded by the minor obstacles of age and cold. He came up to Sebastian and looked at him, and looked at the crowd and looked back at Sebastian. "Son," he said. He called Sebastian. Sonny had called him that for 6 years, which Sebastian had always found both slightly strange and quietly sustaining. "You want to tell me what you did to cause all this?" "I gave a man some gas," Sebastian said. Mr. Ketterman looked at the 187 motorcycles filling Desert Pines from entrance to back fence. "Must have been good guarantee," he said. The laughter that moved through the crowd at that was genuine and warm, and it opened something up in the morning, some last formality dissolving, and people began to talk and move, and the riders began interacting with the park residents, and Sebastian stood in the middle of it, watching his ordinary world, and this completely other world fold into each other and trying to find the seam where they joined. He couldn't find it. Maybe there wasn't one. Mike came and stood beside him. They stood together for a moment, not talking, watching the lot, the conversations happening. The kids from the Reyes family getting their picture taken with a massive bearded man from the Riverside chapter who was laughing at something the teenage son had said, the sound of people being human together in the morning cold. "I need to tell you the last part," Mike said. Sebastian looked at him. "The business," Mike said, "the contracts. Those clients, they know what they're getting and they wanted to sign. But there's something else." He paused. "There's a storage unit registered to the chapter over on Commerce Street. It's got equipment in it, commercial cleaning equipment, industrial grade, buffers, pressure washers, the full kit." He paused again. "It's yours now. The unit's paid for a year. After that, you'll be making enough from the contracts that it won't matter. Sebastian was quiet. We didn't want to give you money, Mike said. Money runs out. We wanted to give you something that runs by itself, that keeps going when we're not here. He turned to look at Sebastian directly. You understand the difference? Sebastian understood it. He'd understood it the moment Karen had put the contracts in his hand. There was a difference between being helped and being set up, between a gift that expired and one that produced. Why, Sebastian said, not accusatory, genuinely wanting to understand the interior of it, the place where the decision had come from. Mike was quiet for a moment. He looked at the lot, at the riders, at the park, residents, at all of it together. Because you didn't ask what we were capable of, he said finally. You saw what we needed and you dealt with that. You didn't look at the patch and make a calculation. You looked at a man trying to get to his brother. He paused. Most people don't do that. Most people see the patch first and last and everything in between. Sebastian thought about the 3 seconds with his foot on the gas. I almost didn't stop, he said. He'd never said this out loud before. I want you to know that. I almost kept driving. Mike looked at him. But you didn't, Mike said. No, Sebastian said. I didn't. Mike nodded slowly. That's the whole story right there, he said. Every man has that 3 seconds. Most men use it to keep going. You used it to stop. He looked out at the lot again. That's not a small thing. That's not nothing. His voice was quiet and certain. That's everything. Sebastian stood with that. The morning had fully arrived now. The November sun coming up over the eastern edge of the desert and putting light on everything, the chrome, the leather, the faces of people he'd lived next to for years, and people he'd never met before today and might never see again. All of it lit up, ordinary and extraordinary, at the same time happening in the parking lot of a trailer park in Barstow, California on a Sunday morning, because a 62-year-old janitor had slowed down on a dark highway and made a decision with his last gallon of fuel. He thought about Evelyn. He thought about what she would say if she could see this. He knew exactly what she would say because he'd been married to her for 31 years and knew the architecture of her responses as well as he knew his own hands. She would say, I told you, I always told you. You never know what someone's going through, Sebastian. You just never know. He stood in the morning light and felt her completely right about that, the way she had been right about most things, and the grief of her absence and the gratitude of her presence in his memory sat together inside him the way they always did not, fighting, just coexisting, which was the best you could ask for. There's one more thing, Frank Dutton said, appearing at his other side. Sebastian looked at him. Frank was holding an envelope. He held it out and Sebastian took it and opened it and looked at what was inside. It was a letter. Single page typed on plain paper, signed at the bottom by a name Sebastian didn't recognize. He read it. He read it again. He looked up at Frank. This is from the school district, he said. The superintendent, Frank said, personal friend of a personal friend. He said this without elaboration, and Sebastian understood that the chain of connection was one he didn't need to trace. The written warning has been removed from your file. Your attendance record has been formally reviewed and the 2 late incidents have been reclassified as transportation emergencies and removed from consideration. Frank paused. You're clean, Sebastian. Your job is clean. Sebastian held the letter. He'd been carrying the weight of that written warning for 5 days. 5 days of doing his job under the knowledge that one more wrong morning would end it, that the margin between where he was and where he couldn't come back from was measured in minutes of arrival time. 5 days of that particular vigilance, that low-grade dread that took up residence behind your ribs and didn't leave. He felt it lift. It lifted all at once, not gradually, and the absence of it was so sudden that he felt briefly lightheaded, the way you feel when something you've been bracing against stops pushing. I don't know what to say, he said. You don't have to say anything, Frank said. This is what you do when you're in a position to fix something that shouldn't have been broken in the first place. He looked at Sebastian steadily. You were doing your job, Sebastian. You were doing your pum, and a bad night cost you something it shouldn't have cost you. We just gave it back. Sebastian folded the letter carefully and put it in his shirt pocket close to his chest. He stood in the middle of Desert Pines with the truck key and the business papers and Phil's card and the superintendent's letter and 187 motorcycles around him and his daughter 20 feet away, watching him with her mother's eyes, and he breathed in the cold morning air, of a Sunday that was nothing like the Sunday he'd fallen asleep expecting. He thought about a jerry can. He thought about what it had cost him and what it had turned into and the distance between those two things which was not measurable in any unit he knew. He thought about what Mike had said. That's not nothing. That's everything. And standing there in the light, Sebastian Bennett, who had spent 62 years being quietly, persistently invisible to the wider world, felt for the first time in longer than he could accurately remember completely seen. The letter in his shirt pocket crinkled when he breathed. Sebastian noticed this throughout the rest of that morning. The small sound of folded paper against his chest every time his lungs expanded, a physical reminder that the thing had actually happened, that he wasn't going to get to work Monday, and find out it had been a misunderstanding or a courtesy that didn't hold. The letter was real. The key in his pocket was real. The 187 motorcycles filling Desert Pines were real, even as they began one by one, and then in groups to roll back out through the entrance and onto the road. They left the same way they'd arrived, with a deliberateness that Sebastian now understood was the club's natural register, the way these men moved through the world when they were being intentional about it. Not loud, not performing, just present, and then gone the sound of the engines pulling away down the road like something immense slowly releasing its breath. It took 40 minutes for the lot to empty. Ray was the last road captain to leave. He pulled up beside Sebastian at the entrance and sat on his idling bike and looked at him for a moment with those reading eyes. "You doing all right?" he said. "I don't have a word for what I'm doing," Sebastian said honestly. Ray nodded like that was the correct answer. "Good," he said. "Hold on to that. The word comes later." He put the bike in gear. "You've got Mike's number. You've got Frank's. You need anything, you call. That's not a courtesy. That's a standing instruction." He rode out and the last engine note faded and Desert Pines was quiet in the way that spaces are quiet after something large has moved through them. A residual stillness, a held breath. The neighborhood hadn't fully released yet. Carla was still there. She'd sent Marcus home with her neighbor's kid, and the baby was asleep in the car seat inside the minivan, and she was standing by Sebastian's trailer door with 2 cups of coffee she'd made from his kitchen, which was something her mother used to do, occupy a space by making it useful. Sebastian took the cup she offered and they stood together in the empty lot. "Tell me everything," she said. "From the beginning, all of it." He told her. He told her the version he hadn't told her in the car Friday morning, not the abbreviated protective version, but the full one. The fuel gauge. The 3 seconds. The way Mike had looked when Sebastian first walked up to him, that assessment, that readiness for disappointment. The cracked fuel line. Pouring the gas in the dark. Mike riding away and the particular feeling of watching the taillight disappear and then getting back in the truck and doing the math one last time and knowing it didn't add up. He told her about walking, about the 6 bikes appearing behind him, about Ray saying with respect, "You're not all right," and the ride into town at 12:30 in the morning, hanging on with the empty jerry can between his knees. Carla listened to all of it without interrupting, which was not her natural mode. She listened the way she listened to things that mattered to her fully without filling the silences with herself. She'd learned that from her mother, too. When he was done, she was quiet for a moment. "You were going to walk 4 miles in 29 degrees, she said. "At midnight, and you weren't going to call me." "You had the kids," he said. "Dad." The word carried everything. "Carla." "You could have called me." "Asaya," she said. "I would have come." "I know," he said. "That's why I didn't call." She looked at him. Her eyes did something complicated. "That is the most you thing you have ever said to me," she said, and it came out somewhere between frustrated and tender, and she didn't fully control which one arrived in her voice. Sebastian drank his coffee. "She would be so angry at you right now," Carla said. "I know. And so proud." "I know that too." Carla looked at the empty lot at the tire tracks in the gravel where 187 bikes had been 2 hours ago. "What are you going to do," she said, "with the business, the contracts?" Sebastian had been thinking about this since Karen had put the papers in his hand. He'd been turning it over the way he turned over any problem that required actual decision rather than reaction. "Run it in the evenings first," he said. "Keep the school job while I build up the client base. Phil said the facilities position stays open for 60 days. If the business looks solid at 60 days, I might not need it." He paused. "And if the school situation goes sideways, despite the letter, I've got a landing spot." Carla was quiet for a moment. You've already thought this through. I've been thinking since 7 this morning. She looked at him with an expression that he recognized because it was the expression Evelyn had used for a specific kind of moment when she saw something in him that she wanted to acknowledge without making a production of it. Okay, Carla said simply. What do you need from me? He looked at his daughter. She had her mother's directness and her mother's eyes and her mother's habit of making herself useful in someone else's kitchen, and looking at her, Sebastian felt the particular complex gratitude of a parent who knows their child became a good person, not entirely because of them, but partly in spite of them. Nothing right now, he said. I've got what I need. She left at 10:15, the minivan pulling out through the entrance with the baby still sleeping back, Carla lifting 2 fingers off the steering wheel in the particular wave that meant, I'll call you later, and also I love you, and also don't be an idiot all at once. Sebastian went inside and sat at his kitchen table and looked at the business papers Karen had given him. He read them carefully the way he read anything important slowly, without skipping, going back to reread the parts that needed rereading. The 3 contracts were legitimate. Commercial standard terms, 30-day notice for cancellation payment, net 15. The rates were fair, not inflated out of charity, but actual market rates, which he recognized because he'd looked into this kind of work 3 years ago, when the school job had started feeling precarious, and he'd done the research and then decided he couldn't afford the startup costs and put the folder in a drawer. The startup costs were handled. The folder in the drawer was no longer necessary. He put the papers down and picked up Phil's card. He turned it over in his hands. 22 an hour with health and insurance. He hadn't had health insurance since Evelyn's death, when he'd aged off her plan and found the individual market rates unworkable, and had spent 5 years telling himself he'd figure it out later, which was the same thing he told himself about the Sportster and the kitchen faucet that dripped and the back molar that needed a crown and half a dozen other things that lived in the category of important but not immediate, which was the category where things went when you didn't have the money and didn't have the time and didn't have the margin for anything that wasn't strictly necessary right now. He set Phil's card on the table next to the business papers. He sat with all of it. He thought about a version of the previous Tuesday night where his foot had stayed on the gas, where he'd registered the patch and done the math and told himself it wasn't his problem and kept driving. He would have made it to Barstow, barely coasting on fumes the last mile, and filled up at the Arco on Main, and driven home and gone to bed and gotten up on Wednesday with his $16.40 an hour and his $63 and his written warning and the slowly failing truck and his whole life exactly as it had been. And Mike Gallagher would have pushed his Harley through the cold until it became clear that nobody was stopping and called for help on the satellite phone and gotten there late, and maybe Danny would have been all right and maybe he wouldn't have, and Sebastian would never have known either way. That version of Tuesday night was the likely version. That was the version the odds had been pointing toward. Everything that had happened since was the version that existed because of 3 seconds. He picked up his phone and called Mike. It rang twice. Sebastian. Mike's voice alert present the particular quality of a man who answered his phone like he'd been waiting for it. I've been sitting here with all of it, Sebastian said. The truck key and the papers and Phil's card and the letter. I've been sitting here trying to... He paused. I don't know how to hold all of this. I want you to know that. I'm not ungrateful. I don't have words big enough for how ungrateful I'm not. But I'm sitting here and I feel like there's something I'm supposed to understand and I haven't fully gotten there yet. Mike was quiet for a moment. What are you trying to understand? Why it matters, Sebastian said. To you. Not the reason you'd tell somebody who asked. The real reason. A long pause. Sebastian waited. He'd learned in these few days that Mike's pauses were working pauses, the silence of a man actually thinking rather than preparing to speak. Danny called me again this morning, Mike said. From the hospital. He's been trying to call since yesterday. They keep taking his phone. He paused again. He told me something he's never told me about the night of the cardiac event before the ambulance came. He said he was lying on his kitchen floor and he thought he was sure that was it. That was the end. And his last thought before the ambulance got there wasn't about his house or his money or anything he'd built. It was about his grandkids, about whether they'd remember him. Another pause. His youngest granddaughter is 4 months old. She's not going to remember him unless he's there. You understand what I'm saying? Yeah, Sebastian said. You gave me the chance to be in that hospital room, Mike said. You gave Danny the chance to still be there for that little girl to remember. Every other thing, the truck, the business, all of it, that's just us trying to do something proportionate to what you actually did. And we can't. We know we can't, but we try. His voice was even and certain. That's the real reason. Sebastian sat with the phone and let that land. How is he? Sebastian said. Danny. Loud, Mike said, and that almost smile came through the phone, somehow came through in the quality of his voice. He's arguing with the nurses about his diet and trying to call me every 4 hours and complaining about the television reception. He's going to be fine. Sebastian laughed, and the laugh was clean and real. Good, he said. That's good. Sebastian, Mike said, I want to ask you something. Go ahead. The Sportster you sold. What year? Sebastian blinked. The question was so specific and so unexpected that it took him a moment to calibrate. 94, he said. Sportster 883, burgundy. I put new bars on it and rebuilt the carb myself. Did you miss it? Every time I see a bike on the road, Sebastian said, which was the complete honest truth. Okay, Mike said, I want you to come down to San Bernardino next weekend. There's someone I want you to meet. A guy named Torres who runs a shop on Baseline. He restores Sportsters, specifically old ones, and he's been sitting on a 1994 XL8 83 for about 6 months because he hasn't found the right buyer. Mike paused. I think he found him. Sebastian went very still. Mike, you're not buying anything, Mike said. Torres owes me a conversation. That's all this is. You come down, you meet him, you look at the bike. Whatever happens after that is between you and the bike. Sebastian understood this was not entirely true. He understood that whatever happened between him and the bike was going to have very little to do with chance, but he also understood that this was how Mike did things, with room built in for the other person's dignity, without forcing the gift, just clearing the path to it. Next Saturday, Sebastian said. 10 o'clock, Mike said. I'll text you the address. Sebastian set the phone down and sat quietly in his trailer, and for the first time in longer than he could accurately locate, the quiet felt different. Not empty, not the kind of quiet that got too loud after midnight. Just quiet. The honest, clean silence of a space that had enough in it. The following Monday, he went to work at 6:29 on time in the 2019 F-150 that ran without complaint and had heat on both sides and a radio that worked. He parked in his usual spot and went to the supply closet and clocked in and started on the hallway floors. Principal Dawes found him at 8:30. She looked different from last Thursday. Something in her posture was different, more careful, more considered, like someone who'd received information that had caused a recalibration. She was touching her glasses on their chain, but with less certainty than before. Sebastian, she said. Morning, Linda. He'd been calling her Linda for 11 years, and she'd told him twice it was fine, and he'd kept doing it. I received a call on Friday afternoon, she said. From the district office, from the superintendent's office. She paused, clearly choosing words. The documentation regarding your attendance has been reviewed and adjusted. I know, Sebastian said. I have the letter. She looked at him for a moment. Do you want to tell me what happened? She said, not demanding, genuinely asking. Sebastian considered this. He thought about how to explain what had happened in a way that fit inside a conversation in a school hallway between a janitor and a principal on a Monday morning. I stopped to help someone who needed help, he said. It cost me more than I expected. And then some people helped me back. He looked at her. That's the whole thing. She looked at him for a long moment. Something moved across her face, not the administrative expression he usually got, but something more personal. Well, she said, I'm glad you're here. She paused. I mean that. I know you do, he said. Thank you, Linda. She left. Sebastian went back to mopping, but he was smiling now, a small, private smile that he didn't try to contain or explain. The first evening job under the new business ran that Wednesday. The auto shop on Commerce Street needed its floors cleaned after hours, and Sebastian showed up at 6 with the equipment from the storage unit on Commerce, the commercial buffer, the mop system, the supply kit that was better than anything he'd used at the school, and he worked from 6 to 9:30 and did the job the way he did every job, which was thoroughly and without complaint. The shop owner, a man named Garrett, who wore a snap-on cap and had the hands of someone who'd been doing engine work for 30 years, walked through at 9:45 and looked at the floors and then looked at Sebastian. You do this yourself, he said. Just me tonight, Sebastian said. Garrett looked at the floors again. You're going to be hard to get rid of, he said. That's the general idea, Sebastian said. He was home by 10:30. He ate and showered and sat at the kitchen table with a notepad and wrote down what the evening had cost in time and supplies, and what it had earned, and what the margin was. The margin was real. The margin was the kind of real that didn't evaporate when you checked it twice. He put the notepad in the kitchen drawer next to the envelope. The envelope still had $63 in it. He looked at the envelope for a moment, and then he closed the drawer, because the envelope could stay where it was. It had earned its place in the drawer. It could rest there. Danny Gallagher was discharged from Mercy General on a Thursday 12 days after his cardiac event. Mike called Sebastian from the hospital parking lot to tell him. He wants to meet you, Mike said. When he's up for it, maybe 3-4 weeks. Tell him there's no rush, Sebastian said. He'll rush anyway, Mike said. That's Danny. Sebastian sat in the new truck in his parking space at Desert Pines and listened to Mike talk about his brother, with the easy comfort of a man who has recently been reminded how much he values a thing, and he thought about gratitude, about the specific shape of it, the way it moved in a person, the way it looked different depending on which direction it was traveling. He'd been grateful to Mike for what happened after the highway. He understood now that Mike was grateful to him for the same night from the other side, and neither of them was wrong. Gratitude, it turned out, wasn't a ledger. It wasn't a balance sheet with a correct answer at the bottom. It was something alive, something that moved between people and changed in transit and arrived as something slightly different from what it had been when it left. He'd given Mike a gallon and a quarter of gasoline on a cold highway. What had come back was not a repayment. It was a transformation. The same act turned over, looked at from the other side, multiplied by the particular logic of men who understood that some things could not be left unacknowledged. His phone buzzed. Not Mike, a new message from a number he didn't have saved, which turned out to be Torres from the Baseline shop in San Bernardino, confirming Saturday at 10 and attaching 2 photos of the 1994 Sportster XL 883 that he'd been keeping for 6 months because the right buyer hadn't come along. Sebastian opened the photos. The bike was burgundy. It was not the same bike his had been sold in 2008 and had probably changed hands 3 or 4 times since, but it was close enough that his chest did something involuntary at the sight of it. The same color, the same generation, sitting in Torres's shop looking like it was waiting for something it hadn't said out loud. He stared at the photos for a long time. He thought about Highway 155 at midnight and the single headlight in the dark and 3 seconds with his foot on the gas. He thought about the weight of the jerry can and the sound it made going empty and the long walk home in the cold and the particular feeling of doing a thing that cost you something real in the knowledge that it was still the right thing to do. He thought about Evelyn, who had known this about him before he fully knew it about himself, that he was the kind of man who stopped. Not always, not without the 3 seconds of fear and calculation and the very real temptation to keep going. But in the end, when it came to it, he stopped. He always stopped. She'd seen that in him when they were both 24 years old, and she'd loved him for it for 31 years and had been right about it every single time. He put the phone down on the kitchen table next to the notepad and the business papers and Phil's card and the new truck key, all of it together in the same ordinary space where his ordinary life had been conducted for 6 years, and he looked at what his life had become in 8 days. 8 days from a cracked fuel line and an empty jerry can and a decision made in 3 seconds on a dark road. 8 days from invisible to seen, from margin to foundation, from a man holding on by his fingernails to a man with options with work he'd built, with a truck that ran and a business that would grow and a phone full of numbers that belonged to people who had told him in the clearest possible language that he was not alone. He thought about the empty jerry can by the front door. He'd left it there since that night without examining why. He got up now and picked it up and carried it out to the truck and put it in the bed and strapped it down with a bungee cord and stood there in the cold evening air of the Desert Pines parking lot for a moment. He'd keep it, not as a reminder of what he'd given away, as a reminder of what that giving had made possible, of the particular alchemy that happened when a man stopped counting the count and just did the right thing in the dark alone, with no audience and no guarantee, and nothing at the end of it except the knowledge that he'd been the kind of person he'd always meant to be. Mr. Ketterman's light was on next door. Sebastian could smell someone cooking 3 trailers down, something with onions and garlic that reached him in the cold evening air and made him think about dinner and about how hungry he actually was, which was a sign that something in him had settled, because for the past year he'd been eating because eating was necessary and not because he felt hungry, which was what chronic stress did to appetite, which was something he knew from experience and had tried not to think about. He was hungry now. He was genuinely simply hungry, and the smell of his neighbor's cooking reached him, and he registered it as good as something to look forward to as evidence that the ordinary world was still present and available and full of small things worth noticing. He went inside, he made dinner, he ate it at the table, he washed the dishes. He sat in the chair by the window where he sometimes sat in the evening when the desert light was doing something worth looking at, and he looked at it and he thought about Saturday and Torres and the Burgundy Sportster and what it was going to feel like to throw a leg over a bike again after 15 years and what the road felt like, at speed in the morning cold with the high desert opening up on both sides. He thought it was going to feel exactly like it used to feel, like contact, like being present in the world instead of passing through it. He thought it was going to feel like starting. Sebastian Bennett had spent 62 years being a quiet man in a world that did not particularly notice quiet men. And in 8 days, because of a single act of grace on a cold highway, the world had noticed him not because he'd made himself loud, not because he'd demanded anything, not because he'd tried to be seen, but because he'd done the simple, costly, irreversible thing of seeing someone else first. That was the whole story. That was the beginning and the end of it, and everything between. A man with nothing left to give had given his last thing freely, and the world in its unpredictable, imperfect, occasionally magnificent way had given everything back. And Sebastian Bennett, janitor widower, 62 years old, sitting in a chair by a trailer window in Barstow, California with a new truck in his space, in a business with his name on it, and a burgundy motorcycle waiting for him in San Bernardino, was exactly, completely, and undeniably home.